For a soldier of Imperial Japan in 1944, the universe was ordered, righteous, and starkly simple. One life was a debt owed to the emperor, a divine being descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. This was not a metaphor. It was the bedrock of reality. Every action, every thought, every sacrifice was measured against its service to the throne and the nation. The world they inhabited was one of profound material scarcity but immense spiritual wealth. They were taught that their spirit, their Yamato Damashi, was their greatest weapon, an invisible, unbreakable force that would always triumph over the crude material advantages of their enemies. They had seen it work. In China, in Singapore, across the Pacific, they had watched larger, better-equipped forces crumble before their iron will and their willingness to die. Their worldview was a fortress built from duty, honor, and a deep-seated belief in their own cultural and spiritual supremacy. Every meal of thin soup and rice was a sacrament of their purity. Every worn-out boot was a testament to their endurance. They were a nation of gods and warriors, destined to rule. From this Spartan perch, they looked upon their primary enemy, America, with a mixture of contempt and bewilderment. The propaganda posters and radio broadcasts painted a clear picture. America was a nation of soft, materialistic merchants. Its people were individualistic, unwilling to sacrifice, and decadent. They were a culture of jazz music, Hollywood fantasies, and frivolous consumer goods. A hollow giant, rotten from the inside out. Their soldiers were believed to be cowards who would break and run when faced with the holy terror of a banzai charge. The core conflict, as they understood it, was a battle of spirit versus machine, of purity versus corruption, of endurance versus luxury. Japanese strategists sincerely believed that while America could produce more tanks and planes, it could never match the spiritual fortitude of a people willing to sacrifice everything. The central question of the war for them was simple. Could a nation built on comfort and selfishness withstand one built on pain and collective duty? They were absolutely certain they knew the answer. Their entire world depended on that certainty, a certainty that was about to be obliterated by the most mundane of sights. The first crack in this fortress of belief appeared not on the battlefield, but in the humiliating aftermath of capture. For the Japanese soldier, surrender was a concept worse than death, an unimaginable disgrace. Yet, for those who found themselves wounded, unconscious, and now prisoners of the enemy, a series of profound shocks began. The journey to the mainland United States was the first lesson. They were transported on ships where the food was not just plentiful, but bewilderingly so. They were given meat, bread, fruit, items that had become rare luxuries for civilians back home in Japan. Upon arrival at POW camps in places like Wisconsin or Texas, the disorientation deepened. The barracks were clean and sturdy. The guards, for the most part, were not the cruel monsters of propaganda, but professional soldiers who treated them with a distant, almost bureaucratic indifference. These initial experiences were confusing, unsettling pebbles in their shoes. They could be explained away as tricks, as attempts to soften them for interrogation. But they were the preamble to a much larger, more visceral revelation that would shatter their worldview completely. The true inciting incident occurred a few months into their captivity. A group of Japanese prisoners was assigned to a work detail, perhaps repairing a fence or working on a farm adjacent to the camp under the watchful eyes of a few American guards. It was monotonous work, a rhythm of mindless labor that allowed their minds to drift back to the war, to home, to the emperor. Among the Americans supervising them was not an officer, not a man of high rank, but a civilian. He was a middle-aged man with a weathered face and calloused hands, probably a local foreman or skilled laborer hired by the military. To the prisoners, he was the embodiment of the American working class. He looked ordinary, tired even. He didn't carry himself with the air of the elite. He was, in their societal understanding, a peasant, a commoner. They watched him throughout the day. This unremarkable man who represented the faceless enemy they had been fighting. He was the very person their propaganda had promised them was being crushed under the heel of the war effort, starving and broken on the home front. At 5 o'clock, a whistle blew, signaling the end of the workday. The civilian foreman wiped his brow, exchanged a few words with the military guards, and began to walk away. The prisoners watched, expecting him to begin a long trek on foot to a nearby town, or perhaps wait for a communal bus. Instead, he walked to the edge of the field, toward a dusty, unremarkable vehicle parked under a tree. It was a Ford sedan. Not a military vehicle, not a government limousine, but a private car. He pulled a set of keys from his pocket, opened the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine turned over with a confident rumble. For a moment, the Japanese prisoners stood frozen, their tools hanging loosely in their hands. They looked at each other, their faces etched with a silent, profound confusion. In Japan, a car was the exclusive property of the fabulously wealthy, high-ranking military officers, or government officials. It was a symbol of ultimate power and status. Yet, here, in the American heartland, a common laborer, a man of no apparent importance, owned one as if it were a simple household tool. That single, mundane event was more powerful than any weapon. It was a visceral, undeniable demonstration that everything they had been taught about America, about the war, about the world, was a lie. The foreman's car was the lightning strike, but now the thunder began to roll endlessly. The evidence started to accumulate in the most mundane aspects of their new lives, starting with the food. In Japan, the civilian population was subsisting on dwindling rations. School children were told to forage for acorns. The military diet itself was a carefully calculated measure of rice and fish, designed for maximum efficiency. Here, in a prison camp, they were fed thick slices of white bread, a substance so refined it seemed like cake. There was jam and butter. There was sugar for their coffee, a luxury that had all but vanished from Japanese life. Most shockingly, there was meat. Beef and pork were served with a regularity that defied all logic. They were prisoners, the lowest members of this foreign society, yet they were eating better than high-ranking officials back home. This wasn't just about sustenance, it was a weapon of psychological warfare, though an unintentional one. Every meal was a quiet, damning sermon on the sheer, staggering, productive power of the nation that had captured them. An economy that could afford to feed its enemies so well was not an economy on the brink of collapse. It was an industrial behemoth playing by a completely different set of rules. The sheer scale of the American continent was another assault on their senses. Occasionally, prisoners were transported by train between camps, and the journey itself became a source of profound cognitive dissonance. From the barred windows, they witnessed a country that did not appear to be at war. They saw endless fields of corn and wheat, cultivated by giant machines. They saw highways teeming not with military convoys, but with civilian cars, thousands upon thousands of them glinting in the sun. Great freight trains, a mile long, thundered past in the opposite direction, their cars packed not with tanks or artillery, but with tractors, refrigerators, and furniture. Where were the signs of sacrifice? Where were the shortages? In Japan, every scrap of metal, every gallon of fuel, every ounce of rubber was requisitioned for the war. The civilian economy had been bled dry. Here, the war seemed to be a distant project, funded by the nation's surplus energy. This wasn't a country engaged in a desperate, total war for survival. This was a country so powerful that it could fight the largest war in human history on two fronts while its citizens went on vacation. The sight was not just impressive, it was deeply insulting. It made their own people's immense suffering and sacrifice feel tragically small, almost pointless. Within the camps, a silent battle of wills was often waged. Senior non-commissioned officers, like a fictional but representative Sergeant Ida, would try to maintain ideological discipline. When younger prisoners would marvel at some new American excess, Ida would be there to offer the official explanation. The plentiful food was poisoned or designed to make them weak. The happy civilians were actors, part of a grand deception. "It is a trick," he would insist, his voice a low growl. "They are a hollow people. They show us this facade of strength because they are terrified of our spirit. They know they cannot break us, so they try to tempt us, to make us soft like them. Do not look. Remember who you are. Remember the Emperor. For weeks, Ida was a rock of certainty for the other men. He organized secret prayers, led drills in the barracks, and reminded them of the glory of dying for their homeland. He was the embodiment of the Yamato Damashi they had all been taught to revere. He saw the cars, the food, and the endless stream of goods not as a sign of strength, but as proof of the enemy's spiritual corruption, the very weakness Japan was destined to overcome. Sergeant Ida's certainty was shattered by a piece of paper. One day, a guard used an old newspaper to wrap his lunch. When he was finished, he tossed the crumpled pages near a trash bin. Ida, seeing an opportunity to gather intelligence, discreetly retrieved it later. He and a few other literate prisoners smoothed it out in the dim light of their barracks. It wasn't a military document. It was a local newspaper from a small, insignificant town in Wisconsin, and it was filled, page after page, with advertisements. There were ads for washing machines, for vacuum cleaners, for 5 different brands of cigarettes and a dozen types of lipstick. There were grocery store ads announcing sales on beefsteak and oranges. Ida stared at an advertisement for a new Chevrolet, listing a price that, while high, was clearly intended for a mass audience. He tried to do the math in his head, the steel, the rubber, the glass, the man-hours, all for this one civilian luxury, multiplied by the thousands he had seen on the roads. It was impossible. Japan was melting down temple bells to make bullets, and America was using its industrial might to sell lipstick. This was not a facade. You could not fake an entire economy, this casual, thoughtless abundance, displayed on a forgotten piece of newsprint, was the single most definitive proof that the war was already over. They just hadn't been told. This was the true turning point, the moment the final wall of their worldview came crashing down. The foreman's car was a shock, but it could be dismissed as an anomaly. The food could be a trick, but the overwhelming, systemic evidence of a thriving, untouched civilian economy was undeniable. They began to hear news reports from the camp radios, boasting of American war production. 8,000 airplanes a month, a new naval ship every single day. The numbers were so astronomical they seemed like fiction, but now the prisoners had the context to understand them. They finally realized that America was not fighting a total war the way Japan was. It wasn't even close. The United States was fighting a war of overwhelming industrial mathematics, a war of logistics and production that rendered individual bravery and spiritual fanaticism almost irrelevant. The sacrifice of the Japanese people was real, their spirit was strong, but they had been sent to fight a tidal wave with buckets. Their entire ideology, their belief in spiritual superiority over material wealth, was proven catastrophically, undeniably wrong. What would you do when you realize that your entire world, the cause you were willing to die for, was built on a catastrophic miscalculation? The psychological impact of this dawning reality was devastating. A profound silence began to settle over the prisoners. The rigid military discipline they had clung to in the early days of captivity started to fray, not into chaos, but into a deep collective lethargy. The morning salutes toward the distant emperor became less fervent, then for some, ceased altogether. What was the point? Their god-emperor presided over a nation that had sent them into a fight with a diluted understanding of their enemy. Their ancestors, to whom they prayed, had valued a warrior code that was now proven to be tragically obsolete. This was a crisis of the spirit far deeper than the shame of surrender. This was the shame of having been fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The American guards likely mistook this quietness for obedience, for the prisoners finally being broken in. But it was something far more significant. It was the sound of a worldview held for centuries, dying in the hearts of thousands of men, one by one. They weren't just prisoners of war. They were exiles from their own reality. With this realization, every memory of the war was brutally recontextualized. The bonsai charges that were once the ultimate expression of spiritual victory now seemed like futile, wasteful acts of desperation. The friends they had watched die, screaming for the emperor, had not died for a noble cause, but for a fatal miscalculation made by leaders in faraway Tokyo. The enemy they had been taught to despise was not a collection of weak-willed individuals, but the face of an invisible system of production so vast it defied imagination. Their whole lives had been built on the virtue of enduring hardship. But what honor was there in enduring hardship when your enemy had eliminated it as a factor? The humiliation was absolute. They had been prepared to die for their country. They were not prepared for their sacrifice to be irrelevant. The core of their identity, being a Japanese soldier, a servant of the divine emperor, a bearer of the unbreakable Yamato spirit, had been proven to be a fiction. All that was left was a hollow ache, the ghost of a faith that could never be reclaimed. The emotional climax arrived not in a dramatic riot or a mass protest, but in a quiet confession. One evening, the man who had been the camp's pillar of ideological strength, Sergeant Ida, sat with a small group of younger prisoners. The sun was setting over the vast alien landscape of the American Midwest. The guards were a distant presence. For weeks, Ida had been silent, his once fierce eyes now clouded and distant. The younger men, lost and confused, looked to him for answers, but he had none to give. He had spent his life believing in a set of powerful, simple truths. He believed that spirit was stronger than steel, that loyalty was stronger than logic, and that Japan's destiny was manifest. Now, he sat as a man whose gods had failed him. He picked up a small stone, turning it over and over in his calloused hands, the same hands that had gripped a rifle with unshakable faith. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken despair, until finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper, not as a sergeant to his soldiers, but as a broken man to his fellow survivors. "I was wrong," Ida began, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "All of it. We were told this was a war of spirit, a test of wills. It is not. That was a lie we told ourselves in our small island because it was all we had." He paused, taking a slow breath. "Look out there. There are no samurai here. There are factory workers, farmers, clerks. And they have done this. They have built a world where a common man drives a metal carriage to work. We sharpened our souls, while they built machines to build more machines. We thought we were wolves fighting lions, but we were just wolves fighting a storm of steel and oil and food that covers the whole world. It does not care about our spirit. It does not care about our honor. It does not even know we are here." He finally looked at the young prisoners, his face a mask of profound sorrow. "Your friends did not die because their spirit was weak. They died because a single American factory can produce more in a day than our entire nation can in a year. We did not lose to soldiers. We lost to a system. The war was over before we ever fired a shot." Ida's words were the final blow. He had articulated the terrifying truth that had been haunting all of them, giving it voice and legitimacy. With that confession, the last remnants of their old reality vanished. Their hatred for the enemy, the one emotion that had sustained them, evaporated and was replaced by a sense of awe that was almost religious in its intensity. They no longer saw their guards as clumsy American farm boys, but as avatars of this incomprehensible power, men who were casually connected to a source of material strength that was, for all intents and purposes, infinite. Their defeat was no longer a military or political fact, it was a law of nature. Their nation, their culture, their spirit, it had all been weighed on the scales of industrial reality and been found wanting. The old world was gone, incinerated not by bombs, but by the sight of a foreman's car, and the advertisements in a small-town newspaper. How does a person, let alone a nation, even begin to rebuild an identity when the very pillars of their belief system have been turned to dust? When the news of the atomic bombs and the Emperor's final unconditional surrender finally reached the camps in August 1945, it was received by these prisoners not with shock, but with a quiet, grim understanding. For the soldiers still fighting in the Pacific, the Emperor's broadcast was a shattering bolt from the heavens. But for the men in the American heartland, it was merely the formal confirmation of a conclusion they had reached long ago. The atomic bomb was not some magical, unforeseen weapon that had unfairly stolen their victory. It was the logical, terrifying endpoint of the system they had already witnessed. A country that could give every common laborer a car could, in time, also learn to build a bomb that could incinerate a city. To them, the two were born of the same source. As they waited for repatriation, they were no longer soldiers of a defeated army, but men who had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of history. They were returning to a home they knew was in ruins, but they carried with them a secret knowledge, a terrible and transformative clarity about the true nature of modern power. The legacy of this experience became woven into the fabric of post-war Japan. While General Douglas MacArthur and the American occupation forces worked to remake the nation from the top down, these thousands of returning POWs brought the revolution from the bottom up. They were immune to the rhetoric of the unreformed militarists who wanted to blame the defeat on betrayal or a lack of will. They had seen the truth with their own eyes. They spoke in quiet tones in their villages and rebuilding cities, not of glorious battles, but of the endless American highways, the well-stocked grocery stores, and the awesome power of the Detroit assembly lines. They became a powerful grassroots constituency for peace and reconstruction. They had learned the war's hardest lesson. A nation's greatness was not measured by the ferocity of its warriors, but by the productivity of its people. The famous Japanese economic miracle that rose from the ashes was driven, in part, by this generation. Having seen the foreman's car, they returned home with a new, all-consuming ambition: to learn how to build one, and then to build it better. Ultimately, this story of shock and disbelief in a prison camp is more than just a historical anecdote. It's a timeless and universal parable about the profound danger of allowing ideology to blind you to reality. The Japanese Empire built a powerful and compelling worldview based on honor, spirit, and sacrifice. They believed in it so completely that they confused their map for the actual territory. But reality is ruthlessly indifferent to even the most sacred beliefs. It does not care about national myths or spiritual pride. It operates on the cold, hard math of resources, logistics, and production. Willpower is a powerful force, but it cannot stop a tank. Fanaticism is a sharp sword, but it cannot win a war against 1,000,000 factories. The final, crushing truth these prisoners learned is that any belief system, any government, any ideology that detaches itself from the observable facts of the world is destined not just to fail, but to lead its people to ruin. For them, the Second World War did not truly end with a mushroom cloud, but with the quiet, devastating rumble of a civilian's engine starting up, a sound that signaled the absolute victory of a world they never knew existed.